Dear podcast listeners, today we're sitting here with
Luke.
Louise.
And myself, Tone, and today we're going to talk about Luke's paper. Luke, what is your paper about and how did you come up with the idea?
I guess I should start off with my experience as a teacher because that's where my research started actually. So I was teaching in a high school in Singapore for about 4 years. I'm Singaporean myself, and this is a particular top-ranked secondary school in Singapore. And in this particular secondary school, we actually recruit students from China and Vietnam as well by offering them scholarships. And the hope is that along the way that they are in Singapore, they might become citizens someday. So that's the government's plan for why we should be recruiting these students. However, these students, when they come over, they have low proficiencies in English compared to local Singaporeans who grew up speaking English. And they are forced and immersed into this English-speaking environment without much aid or catering to their language needs. Right? So I thought as a teacher that, hey, maybe, I also knew about this framework called Linguistic Human Rights as a BA student, like years ago. And I thought maybe the Linguistic Human Rights framework might apply or not in this particular context to these students. And that was how my research started. I started to think about whether the concept of language, as proposed by the linguistic human rights paradigm, might apply to my students in that elite secondary school.
Can you just explain this paradigm a bit?
Yeah, so according to the linguistic human rights paradigm, an individual's mother tongue is framed as an inviolable human right. So it has to be protected. It has to be protected against dominant languages, especially English, or in China even it would be considered like 普通话. Against the original languages of the speakers themselves. So in that context, my students would be seen to have their rights violated because they would be forced to move towards English in their daily lives.
So you decided to study this. How did you do that?
Well, I started talking to my students. I conducted interviews with them over Skype because at that time I was in London doing my MA and my students were actually scattered all around the world by then. So I interviewed them. I started to think about their own attitudes towards language. Why did they come to Singapore? Why did they want to learn English? And I started to frame their responses towards what linguistic human rights are saying about mother tongue and about language.
So what was your specific question to them and what did you find out?
Well, I found out actually that the attitudes towards migration is pretty much indeterminate, so they don't have a very fixed trajectory in terms of migration. They have more open-ended destinations regarding migration.
So what was your question when they answered it?
I asked them what were their plans, basically about why did they come to Singapore and what were their plans after Singapore at that stage of their lives. These were 17, 18-year-olds, and by the time I interviewed them, they would be 20 or 21. All right. And most of them had indeterminate migratory destinations. Some of them by that stage have left Singapore and they were in the US or UK. And they didn't have plans to return to China, nor did they have plans to return to Singapore. Everything was open-ended at that stage.
And were the students' ideas of migration different to those of the Singaporean government?
No, naturally, of course. So the government actually wanted them to stay in Singapore, but the scholarship was given without a bond that would tie them to the locality. So these students had a different agenda. They had their own project. They were pursuing a particular lifestyle, and that particular lifestyle didn't entail staying in Singapore if they could help it. And we are talking about academically elite students. So they could basically go anywhere in the world so long as they had the means, the financial means to do it. And most of them aimed to get to the top-ranked universities in the West. So that was where most of them ended up.
So they didn't look at it as if their linguistic rights were violated?
Yeah, naturally, they would. In fact, if we were to compel them to have learned to learn English through their own mother tongues, and that was the question I posed to them: would you want to learn English through your own mother tongue?
As a second language.
Yeah. Most of them said no; they would prefer to learn English as it is. And the reason for coming to Singapore was to pick up English in order to move on up the socioeconomic ladder, so to speak. And that was how, learning English was a way for them to get to the West through Singapore.
So there seems to be a difference between the students' agenda in terms of perhaps economic interests and the protection of heritage languages in terms of protecting culture or cultural agendas.
Exactly. So one of the findings as well is that these students didn't necessarily rank their linguistic practices as something that is to be preserved. I mean, they were okay with it changing, and they were okay with English becoming a dominant part of their identity and their lifestyle. So in fact, if we had compelled them using a linguistic human rights paradigm to preserve their original mother tongues and so on, perhaps that in itself is a violation of their human right to move, their own ambitions and aspirations.
So what is the main conclusion of your paper?
Well, the main conclusion is that, especially in migratory contexts, it's much too complex when we try to apply, generalizations and reductionist theories regarding language. And, my paper...
What do you mean by reductionist theories?
Reductionist theories would be, we try to reduce theories that can generalize human behavior and practices into something which is simple and easy to understand. But, the world isn't simple and easy to understand, right? Linguistic practices of migrants, especially in a cosmopolitan city like Singapore, is extremely complex. It's multi-layered. It's, the term that people use today is super diverse. It's diversity 2.0 in a way. Because of migration. And so the takeaway from my paper would be that we shouldn't be too quick to impose or to propagate theories which are too simplistic and too reductionist and that aim only to generalize. We should always look at the context.